Yeah, and environmentalism, I think, it will be increasingly the biggest preoccupation of citizens, period. And all of the other issues we deal with are kind of a subset of that.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Jonathan Rose, Professor of Political Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. One thing we discuss is the 2019 Canadian federal election on October 21st, which was just a couple weeks before the release of this episode. We also discuss minority governments, the civic duty of politics, electoral reform, voter apathy, citizen assemblies or deliberative bodies that don't really exist in the structure of our government today, but could exist in the future. Western alienation, Donald Trump, of course, the role of social media, populism, environmentalism, and climate change. It's a fascinating and detailed discussion that goes to the heart of what politics is and what politics faces in Western societies today. Now, if you like this episode, please give it a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. You can also do the same thing on Facebook. And go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. You can find all previous episodes there, as well as a way to get in touch with me, whether by email or on social media. I really do value your feedback and your suggestions. All right, Jonathan Rose, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ben.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Me too.
There's a lot of things that we can talk about here. Obviously, we're not long after the 2019 Canadian election, and there's a lot of food and food for thought and fodder in that we can dig into. But I wanted to ask the first question, and I know it's something that's relevant for you. Which is always the same. It's deliberately broad for a deliberately broad response, but I know you've got something specific here. So, Jonathan, what on earth is going on?
Well, I'm laughing because I teach a course here at Queen's University called What is Going On? Explaining the election of Donald Trump. And that course is really around trying to put the messy business of politics into a larger context. And from what I've been able to gather from your podcast, that's the point of this one as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what's going on? I think we are in a really interesting time having a minority government elected in October 2019. And we will see what the plans are for the next couple of years.
Why do you think that a minority government was elected? I know that's a really, really broad question, but why is it now a minority government?
So, governments or elections, I should say, are really interesting things. It used to be said that elections were a mandate for people to give governments for something. And the only election I can think of most recently is the free trade election, when the whole conversation in that election was around one issue. And that is whether we should have free trade with the United States or not. Most elections are not like that. They're kind of a mixture of what you think of the leader, what you think of the policies, whether you want to send a message to the government, whether you want to vote for parties that have traditionally not had representation, and what that says about the state of play of politics generally. In other words, one can interpret the vote for the Greens and the vote for the NDP as doing politics differently. And one can interpret the vote for the Liberals as a modified vote of confidence in what they're doing, but a clear message to Justin Trudeau that things aren't what they said what it would be. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important. When he ran in 2015, it was hugely an aspirational win. So I think people were voting for a new kind of politics, and he campaigned on that.
In a way, that was a change election back in 2015. There was a feeling like, hey, let's change things up a bit. And I don't know if the sentiment in Canada is the same right now. But there's something interesting here, and I know that this is a strategy on the part of political campaigns to define the ballot box question.
That's right.
To define the question that when you go into the box and make your choice, what's the single thing that's sticking in your mind? It's not often successful, but it does nudge people in certain directions. Obviously, in this last election, the ballot box question that the Conservatives wanted people to ask was, is Justin Trudeau a phony, for example?
Exactly.
If I go into the ballot box with a question, most people are going to say, yeah, and they're going to vote Tory, therefore.
Right.
Whereas the NDP might have a different ballot box question. I wonder to what extent that's actually what's happening in an election in people's minds, and if that's effective, or that's just another way to explain this whole conundrum and almost chaos of political campaigning.
Yeah, it's a bit of a black box, isn't it? Parties have, as you've said, a desire to frame the election in certain ways, but voters are complicated individuals. They bring with them preconceived ideas of what government should be, of what party politics should be, and also how they voted in the past, which is often a big predictor of how people vote in the future. Our partisan stability in Canada is pretty constant. So that means people aren't really changing their minds a lot. So when they do change their minds, it's for a particular reason. Like they're not happy with the incumbent government, or they want to see a new kind of policy, say the green policy. But they're also influenced by what's happening in the world, right? Mm. I mean, they're influenced by Greta Thunberg, who made a speech in the UN during the election campaign, and then came up to Alberta. And for some people, that probably magnified that issue. For others, it was like poking the bear.
Right.
And, for many Albertans, maybe that was another example of feeling beaten up by an outsider. In this case, an outsider from outside of Canada, but still an outsider.
Yeah. It's interesting. I used to work in politics for a couple of years. I guess it was more than a couple of years, but I actually was part of the 2015 campaign on the Liberal side, and I was campaigning for a candidate in Calgary.
Okay.
And so there was a lot of work we had to do to separate ourselves from the federal party because, since I was born in the 80s, there has been a deep suspicion and skepticism of not just Liberals, but anything Eastern Canada in Alberta. Right. And that's part of the explanation why people are conservative in Alberta, not because they're small c conservative, but because they're anti-Ottawa or anti-Liberal, and they want to have a protest against that, and they want to have their own thing. That's very much part of the DNA.
Yeah.
But there was something interesting I discovered one day knocking on the doors for this candidate, and it was someone said to me, I'm voting Conservative, which was a typical answer to the question in Calgary and in Alberta. And I said, why? And they said, well, it seems everybody else is doing that in my neighborhood. Huh. And I was blown away by that response. Now, I've said that story to some people before, and they've said, yeah, what's so special about that? Of course. It kind of just rolled under the bridge for them. For me, it was surprising because I've never seen my civic duty to vote in that way. I should look at what other people in my neighborhood are doing and go the same way. That's anathema to what a democracy is for me. But it was extraordinarily revealing to me of what voting and what elections and what politics means to a lot of people, which is maybe it's a much smaller part of your daily life. And therefore, I'm still going to vote. And where are my cues coming from? And this sort of tribal nature or this feeling of, well, how do I do service to my community? And everyone else seems to be doing that. I guess I'll do the same thing. Do you think that that's an accurate description of what politics is for those who are not an expert of it, those who don't watch CBC or CNN 10 hours a day?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, politics is a civic duty, and people have busy lives, and this is one thing that they do in the course of the day. One thing that is noteworthy that hasn't been studied yet is the huge turnout in advance polls in the 2019 election.
Right.
And, I don't want to speculate because we haven't done studies on it, but it might be that the ritual of going to a ballot box, seeing your friends and neighbors there, having conversation about the civic duty is diminishing. And people see it as one of the chores they have to do along with picking up groceries for dinner. And if they can do that more efficiently the day before the election, then they'll do it. If that's the case, then that's really depressing, because it means that this one unifying thing that Canadians do to exercise their democratic voice is being lost. And it might tell us something about elections in general, or it might tell us something about the way people think about political parties, or it might tell us something about the fact that our electoral system returns fairly normal traditional results. The point you raised about Alberta being Tory blue since the National Energy Program, since Pierre Trudeau's National Energy Program. it's complicated. Elections are complicated.
So do you think when it comes to this civic duty of voting, I mean, do you think that people are disinterested? Do you think that having, say, electoral reform, which was a promise of the Liberal the Liberal Party in 2015, that they clearly just said, no, we're not going to do that, that this would be the last election fought under first past the post. Do you think that it changed like that to, say, proportional representation or some kind of mixed member representation or what? There are many, many different options. It's a smorgasbord of opportunity here. Mm-hmm. Do you think that would actually have an impact on people's desire to participate? Do you think they would feel, well, I'm more interested in getting involved, maybe my voice will be heard? Or do you think that the civic duty aspect of this would probably stay about the same?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a problem with the chicken and egg, right? I mean, electoral reformers like to remind us that countries that have proportional representation have a higher voter turnout. That's right. True. But they also have a higher level of engagement in other kinds of non-politics way in social institutions and unionization, etc. So you can't separate voting from those other aspects. But it is true that countries that have made the flip from first past the post to a proportional system, like New Zealand, experienced a bump in voter turnout. And most experts attribute that to a couple of reasons. One, the novelty of the system. So it's something new. People want to try that. But also a recognition that their vote actually will be translated more fairly into seats.
Right.
I mean, you know, I feel bad for the New Democrats in this election, the 2019 election, because they got 24 seats. And if we had any kind of proportional system, they would have basically doubled that to about 54 seats.
Yeah, and the Greens too.
And the Greens too, absolutely. So the Greens ended up getting 6.5% of the popular vote with 3 seats. 6.5% of a 338-member legislature is, 20-something. So we know that this electoral system discriminates against smaller parties. And some would say that's a design feature, not a bug.
Right.
So that's good. We want there to be a change between the red party and the blue party.
And we want there to be a mechanism for a strong national majority government.
Right.
That whether it doesn't happen all the time, but it happens a lot of the time, much more commonly than we would ever get someone or an election where you have more than 50% of the vote going to any one party. But I wonder if, we talk about electoral reform. It's a very interesting question. It's the structure of our democracy, and I think it has massive impacts. But I wonder if it's hiding a deeper question of why voters are apathetic about elections. I mean, we've seen over the years, I think 2019 was second only to 2015 in terms of voter turnout. But other than that, it's been a general long-term decline in people's going to the ballot boxes and thinking it'll make a difference. And I wonder if there's a deeper cultural or historical rationale there that we need to unpack and talk about, which regardless of electoral reform is there and present in our society. And if it maybe is even connected to social media, the internet, or just a sort of malaise with democracy because no one's had to fight for it unless you're about 80 years old. There's no sense that this has been earned. It's just, I'm born with it and here we go. And actually, there was a poll done not too long ago in the United States that shows that a disturbingly large number of people, something like 15-20%, would be okay with army rule because they think it would be more efficient, more effective, would get things done. And the frustration, of course, especially in the United States with deadlock is, I just want things to move. I want laws to be passed. I want government to do the work. But they wouldn't say they don't understand. There seems to be this lack of appreciation for what this is. Now, that's just one angle of attack. And I'm wondering if you would think that there's another aspect of this culture that may be changing that is underneath this call for electoral reform.
Right. Yeah. I mean, others have written a lot about, the increasingly atomistic nature of our society and mobile devices, and the internet has only exacerbated that. We go around, tuning out the world around us, and we become more focused to ourselves. And that's a kind of an existential problem. You're right that democracy is only one part of, and changing the electoral system may not solve that as well. But what I think it screams out for is the capacity, that there is capacity with people to be more engaged, but there isn't a motivation by governments of all political stripes to do that. And if we turn over power to citizens, they manage to get it right and do a good job. And there's so many experiments going on around the world that demonstrate this brilliantly.
Yeah. Well, and this is some of the work that you do with Citizen Assemblies, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at what's happening in Ireland, parties there have been gridlocked on same-sex marriage and divorce, with neither of the two larger parties wanting to take that step and make a decision. And what they did is they allowed a randomly selected group of citizens to meet over a long period of time to deliberate, to think about the issue, and to make a recommendation to the Irish Parliament to make a decision. And as a result of that, they now have gay marriage and more liberal abortion laws. So that's, I think, a great example. In the UK, they're doing it with Brexit. They're doing it with issues around engaging people on local matters. And this has been something that's been done in Brazil, in Porto Alegre most famously, but around the world. The idea is a real simple one, and that is when you get citizens who have a real stake in the outcome and they're able to learn and demonstrate a knowledge and a capacity, and that they know they will have an impact, they do rise to the occasion. So to answer, this is a long-winded answer to your question.
Excellent.
But to answer your question about lower voting turnout, is perhaps the instrument isn't the best one, or perhaps we need more tools in our arsenal to have that kind of democracy that we want. I mean, we tend to think of an election as the only instrument, and it's once every 4 years for 65% of us.
It's fascinating because what we're talking about here is maybe looking at the deeper and broader structure of government and the public sphere as a whole, which we don't question. I mean, the whole idea of how we run an election is up for grabs. We can talk about that. But once the people are elected, it's all the same, right? We might talk about increasing transparency. We might add a new committee or change the cabinet a little bit or give someone a new title, open a new department. That's all fine and dandy. But the structure of government remains the same. It's very conservative in that way. There's a book, I don't know if you've heard about it, called Tear Down by David Meslin.
Sure, absolutely.
Have you read it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Fascinating. And this is the kind of stuff that he's talking about. How do we look at the meat and bones of government and ask ourselves, what are we trying to do here? And he calls the book Tear Down. There's 3 different reasons, but one of them would be the way you would tear down a car and look at the constituent parts. Sort of like Elon Musk is doing with Tesla and saying, well, what is the first principle of a vehicle? What are we trying to do, and what can we remove, therefore, from the equation to make it cheaper and easier to build? The same can be true with government. If we tear it down and look at it and then have to rebuild it, well, having people together in a room like we're sitting right now, without the lens of a camera glaring at them, what kind of decisions would they make? I think they most often, 20 people picked at random, I would trust them to make decisions in my best interest, because I assume that most of them would be somewhat similar to me. And in fact, I might trust them more than someone who's just trying to gin the camera to win an election. Now, that is extremely simplistic, I know. But there's an element of trust here, and trust is one of these bedrock principles of government. Anyways, that's a long-winded response to your what you were saying. But yeah, what do you think?
Well, I mean, on Dave Meslin's book, Tear Down, it's a really great read for people who are interested in how our democracy can be improved. And you're right. I mean, he talks about a couple different ways of tearing things down. We rebuild a car and we tear it down in order to put it back. And he says then in real estate, there are things like a tear down of a house. But he's not talking about that. When you talk in the real estate tear down, you destroy a house to put up a mansion. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the tech nerdy version of teardown, which is you disassemble an iPhone and put all the pieces on this beautiful mat and take a photo of it so others can see the constituent elements.
Or if you're Samsung trying to make a better phone, you tear down the other guy's phone to see how to do it.
Yeah. So I think having us introspectively look at how our institutions work and think is a good way to do it. And, not to be too pessimistic, there have been some big changes, right? I mean, we no longer have a Senate that is appointed with cronies, although, as an interesting footnote, what will the Liberal government do about that if they want to have cabinet representation from Alberta and Saskatchewan.
And I just read today that they're looking at Naheed Nenshi potentially giving him a Senate seat. Obviously, he'd no longer be mayor of Calgary. They'd have to appoint, I think, 4 to 8 total senators, and they'd have to get the permission still of the Queen, is what I read, right. Which is absurd to me, but I guess there are elements of our Constitution that have not been repatriated yet, but that they could appoint him as a senator. I don't know if that's likely to happen, but...
Yeah, I mean, the recommendation of the government is made to the Governor General, and the Trudeau government in 2015 did away with patronage appointments. So I guess the question is whether Naheed Nenshi would be a patronage appointee. But I think it is important for representation and for the important voice that the West has to be represented in cabinet. I mean, when talk about teardown, it's an interesting connection. The Prime Minister's cabinet will have to accurately represent the constituent parts of the country. He's already said it's going to be a gender equal cabinet, and that's great. But the cabinet needs to look like the rest of the country. Mm-hmm. And how will they do that without representation from Alberta and Saskatchewan?
Well, not just look like the rest of the country, but be accountable to those voices. And I don't know if a senator would ever be accountable to any voices if they're just appointed, but it certainly does feel that way for an MP. You know, an MP from Vancouver has very different interests to an MP from Montreal, for example, or from Calgary or wherever. And what's interesting there is that they do have to, when they're in cabinet, they do have to swear cabinet secrecy. They do have to essentially go by what the Prime Minister says and defend those decisions, even if they don't agree with them. But they always have the option of saying, no, I'm not doing this one. I'm out. And that has happened in Canada. It's happened maybe more frequently in Britain, where a cabinet minister will just say, I resign. I'm not going along with this. And that is it's a safety valve. It's a safety mechanism in our politics, I think, that allows a cabinet, if they truly represent the interests of the country at large, to fracture if it's making a decision. It's not quite veto power, but it's something close, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in Canada, we have the strongest party discipline among parliamentary democracies in the world. I mean, you've just referenced the mother parliament, the UK.
Right.
And there, it's not uncommon for MPs to engineer an ouster of their own prime minister. So we would never see that in Canada. And I'm not suggesting that happen here, but it does tell us something about the enormous power the prime minister has, not only over his cabinet, but over his caucus. And when a cabinet minister like Jody Wilson-Raybould speaks out about the severe and intense consequences of that.
The SNC-Lavalin thing.
Yeah, and Jody Wilson-Raybould will be a really interesting voice to listen to over the coming years. And I think she'll have a disproportionate influence because she will not be constrained by party. She is well known to the media. She's articulate and smart. And if you're someone in the media, you're going to go to her to ask what's really going on. What are the dynamics going on at play in cabinet? From your time in cabinet, can you tell us? So I'm looking forward to hearing her voice on that. And I think that's really great for holding the government to account.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think Canada has developed a system, or just a set of traditions, conventions, customs, by which the Prime Minister has so much power, and not just the Prime Minister, but party discipline is so strong compared to other Westminster democracies? I mean, is there a reason for that in our culture, or is it just the luck of the draw and the way that our politics has evolved over time?
Well, I mean, social scientists would talk about something called path dependency, which is the biggest predictor of what you did what you do in the future is what you did in the past. So, in a sense, there's this kind of inertia for deferring to the power of the Prime Minister, and there's been much written about the growing power of the Prime Minister's office in controlling members of Parliament and controlling his caucus. But of course, this was talked about by Pierre Trudeau decades ago, who said, 20 yards out of Parliament Hill, an MP is nobody. And he was sadly right. But that speaks more about our system than it does about cabinet confidence or the power of the PM. It speaks a lot about the role that MPs have as being simply just the mouthpiece for government and not representing regional interests.
I want to go back to devolving power to, say, citizen assemblies, or changing the structure generally of our government, whether it's the Constitution or not. And I wonder, is it possible to, if we, say, Canadians, wanted to make these changes and thought, yeah, we need to, whether tear down or reform our government, do you think that there's appetite in the political sphere to make that happen? Or do you think that this will just be a football kicked and kicked and kicked until people are just fed up? I mean, I'm just, I guess, asking, is this feasible to occur?
Well, one of the great things about minority government is that the governing party is more beholden to other parties, likely the NDP in this case. So they have always advocated a strong reform of institutions and processes. So whether they make good on that, I mean, time will tell. But this is the time when those kinds of institutional changes will occur for sure.
It would be interesting if, say, the NDP said, look, we'll do whatever you want for 4 years if you give us electoral reform. You have a majority government, essentially, if you deliver on this. Yeah,
and the NDP, it's in the NDP's interests and the Green interest. It's. I mean, the Conservatives are marginally affected. The Liberals, of course, were the huge net beneficiaries of the first past the post system this election, but they've been losers before. But of course, as Andrew Scheer says regularly, he got more votes than the Liberals. So he may want to rethink electoral reform as well.
Yeah.
I don't know whether there's an appetite in Canada for it. I think that there's a vocal minority of people who are really effective and smart in keeping the agenda on the front burner. But for many Canadians, they're more interested in bread and butter issues like climate change and taxes and, middle class economic benefits.
Yeah, I think Justin Trudeau knew that when he decided not to go for electoral reform not to follow through on that promise, he knew that most people who cared about that were political nerds already,
right,
who are probably already going to have their vote decided.
Sure.
Right? I mean, most people, electoral reform, yeah, cool. Is that going to change my taxes? I don't,
right,
whatever. The guy that said to me, I'm going to vote where my neighbors vote, I mean, I can't imagine that's anywhere on his list of priorities. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a shrewd, yet still authentic choice for a governing party to forego a promise like that, and look at the result. I mean, I don't think they lost that much as a result of that.
No.
But I want to turn our lens to the United States for a moment, if only because of your first response to the first question.
Right.
What is going on when you explain Donald Trump?
My goodness.
I know that that's a very dangerous question because it could mean the rest of our conversation gets sucked up by the oxygen of the American president. but you dropped it at the beginning, and I didn't want to lose it. So this is a Political Science 101, right?
That's right.
Explaining Donald Trump, which I think is a great entryway into political studies, understanding how could this happen, because it ties to so many different things. So yeah, I mean, I guess, can you explain Donald Trump?
Yeah, well, actually, Ben, let me just clarify one
Sure.
thing is the course is not for politics students.
Okay.
It's we were at a booth, a university booth, talking about trying to get students to come to Queen's, and an engineer who was a Queen's student there said, "Do you teach any courses about Trump?" And I said, "No, we don't." He said, I'm an engineering student. I'm not going to take any politics courses. I hear Donald Trump and I see Donald Trump on the news. I don't know what's going on. I'd love a course to explain that. And I thought that would be really valuable for students who never take a politics course to learn something about civics, and in doing so, to learn the foundations of the American system and perhaps the Canadian system by using the lens of Donald Trump. So, what's going on there? I mean, we're in the middle of an impeachment hearing. He will almost certainly be indicted by the House of Representatives, which means that impeachment will go to the Senate, which requires 2/3 to pass. And there's a slight majority of Republicans, and it will not pass there. What it means for the electoral fortunes of Donald Trump 4 years from now is an open question. Whether that sustained conversation of him on the spotlight of being criticized will reinforce and re-energize his base is one thing, or whether some moderate Republicans will begin to see the light and realize that he is a liability, not just for his party in the long term, but also the country.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if I was a moderate Republican, I would say, let's not think about the next 4 years. Let's think about the next 40 years and what this guy is doing to our party.
One thing I really appreciated in this conversation so far is our discussion of the ballot box question. Now, this may not define or drive elections most of the time, but it is what political parties are trying to achieve. What is the central question of an election? Or at least, what are people trying to say that it is? And that, I think, can give insight into what the key issues are, either for different groups of people, for different parties, or perhaps for a society at large. Now, coming up in this conversation, here's one thing that Jonathan said that stuck with me, which is that politics is largely about symbols. That's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. I know these are big questions, and they're asked maybe too frequently, especially in the news media and on social media. It's just a constant barrage of Donald Trump, which in a way is exactly what he wants and always wanted, was just the spotlight. Mm-hmm. Even if it's people putting the spotlight on him because they hate what he's doing and what he's saying, he's still getting the light. Yes. And that's kind of the intention here. So I hate to drag us into these questions, but at the same time, I'm invigorated by it because it does correspond to everything in political studies. I mean, this whole question of populism, let alone Donald Trump, is so important right now for arresting and understanding and seeing our moment in time and where it may lead. It's also, it's very, at times I become scared, I guess, for lack of a better word. Yesterday I was reading an article in the New York Times about how the Justice Department is now opening a criminal investigation, not just an administrative review, but a criminal investigation into the origins of the Russia investigation from 2016, which essentially, we all remember at the time, the entire United States government said Russia is trying to hack the election, and then Russia tried to hack the election. It was clear, it was essentially a consensus in the government, and now, apparently, if I'm reading this correctly, the current government is seeing that as a crime, that they even tried to see this investigation through. Now, this seems like a lot of words and verbiage and whatever. What it sounds to me like is an unsustainable change in procedure in the United States government, where the guys that come after are essentially treating the guys before as criminals. And this will go back and forth until it just breaks. Because it was the question actually during the debates where Donald Trump said, if I win, I might just lock her up. She's a criminal. Mm-hmm. And that was abhorrent to many liberals, and I mean lowercase l liberals, who, the proponents of liberal democracy, who said the whole basis of our democracy is the fact that we don't treat our opponents as enemies. We treat them as the other side, and we accept when they win. But this review at the Justice Department, which obviously is politically motivated, correct, seems to be, to me, a sign of scary days to come. Yeah, well, I think that you've just hit the nail on the head in that last sentence, and that is, it is about the politicization of the public service. And that is really the most frightening part, that the public service, which is so integral, independent public service, which is so integral to a functioning liberal democracy, is being eroded by it being manipulated for partisan ends. And the reason why it is important is because public service needs to serve any political master, and that we know that in any liberal democratic government there will be governments of other political stripe. There needs to be confidence among that political party, but also among citizens, that the people who are administering those policies and promises will do so faithfully. And if the public service is politicized and they're saying we're not going to do it, that represents a problem. Donald Trump's continual use of the phrase deep state is another example of how he is trying to demonize something that has not been demonized before. And when you think about Watergate and how the Justice Department, carried through those things, even though they may have had qualms about it, it's so different this time. And that's disturbing. Yeah, and the Republicans obviously say, well, it was already politicized before. The 2016 investigation was a political investigation to prevent Donald Trump from winning, and he won despite all the odds.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is that it's this whole fake news thing too, right?
Right.
Where there is no truth that we all share. Mm-hmm. There is no common certainty that we can base ourselves on and then argue about that. Everyone's got their own idea about what's going on, and so I can't argue with a Republican about this because they're just going to walk away believing what they believe, and I guess I'm going to do the same thing. If Donald Trump wins in 2020, mm-hmm. And I don't mean to be a scaremonger, and I don't mean to be too, I guess, political about this, but what could that mean for not just American democracy, but this whole Western notion of democracy? Is it under threat, or are we making too much of it?
Oh, I think it's absolutely under threat. I mean, I think when you start to think about institutions of society like the mass media, who play a hugely important role in holding government to account, are under siege in the United States, and we're seeing it spill over here as well. And, although the People's Party of Canada didn't pick up seats in Canada, there were still a significant number of people who voted for them. And their voice was legitimated through the debates in Canada and in the election, and through regular airings of Maxime Bernier's ideas, as crazy as some of them are. I think as Canadians, we need to worry about the spillover effect that this has, but also to be mindful that these forces and these populist impulses exist here as well. Shortly after the election, Catherine McKenna's campaign office was vulgarly defaced, and I was glad to see that Doug Ford and other conservatives and people of all political stripe condemned it, and that's what's needed, and it's good that that's happened here. But that doesn't happen in the States. So when Trump crosses the line, you don't hear Republicans say, well, we might disagree with our Democrat opponents, but this is no way to say it. And that, to me, is deeply worrying.
Well, he's changing where the lines are drawn simply by walking over them. Like yes. A lot of not just American democracy, but democracy anyway is based on not just what's in the law, not just what's written, but by the customs and the traditions that we all seem to accept. I mean, the idea of having to have a senator in the cabinet of this country or a member of parliament is just tradition. It's just convention. The prime minister can actually appoint anyone he wants. You and I can be appointed right now if you wanted to. But the convention says that we don't do that. And since 1867, that's been the convention. And that is extremely powerful. The whole idea of George Washington choosing, after his time in office as president, to simply go home and have a new president come in, there was no tradition at the time. Right. If he had decided, I'd like to be president for life, well, we'll just change the Constitution. No problem. I'm obviously we're being counterfactual here, but what's interesting about that is that at that time, no one had it in their mind that this was at all sacred. The Constitution, America, being Americans and not British subjects, this was just a few years old. Mm-hmm. And so now it's sacred all these years later, but it doesn't take much. It just takes a guy walking over the line to erase the line. Yeah. And it's less and less difficult for people who come after to walk over the same line until the line is no longer there.
Yeah, and the broader point I think that you raise is that when you have radical problems, you need radical solutions. And that's the case with representation in cabinet, but also the case for something as profound as climate change. I tell my kids who are digital natives that there was a time when people didn't have computers, and 5-6 years later, everyone had a computer, and that was the case with cell phones. And there was a time, or there is a time now at the beginning where people are thinking, for example, electric cars are a niche fringe item, and we don't need to worry about emissions, even though the U.S. government just decreased emission limitations in California. We're going to need really radical, new, innovative solutions. And this is where, getting back to a previous part of our conversation, where I think citizens can come in. And if we engage citizens with thinking creatively about these problems, they're not constrained by partisan interests, as politicians of all political stripe are, but rather they go in there trying to get the best possible outcome. And this is what I've seen time and time again with these citizens' assemblies and deliberative bodies. They don't have an agenda. They really just want what is best. And they reason and think creatively and well around deeply complex policy issues. And maybe the problem is that we have been ossified by having these traditional political parties make all of these decisions, and we need to open the doors and let a little light in.
When it comes to this citizen creativity in these assemblies, would social media, technology, the internet amplify and magnify the power of these groups, or would it be more likely to interfere?
Yeah, and that's a big debate amongst people who do this kind of work. I'm of the opinion that there's no substitute for sitting down and talking face to face, and that when you're confronted with somebody whose opponents, whose ideas you disagree with, it's much harder to vilify them in person than it is behind a screen. What citizens engagement calls for is a greater degree of face-to-face interaction. And technology, I think, can get in the way of that.
Well, that's a dilemma that I've faced with this podcast, actually. People have asked me, well, if you want to do conversations with people around the world, which I'd love to do, why don't you just do it over Skype? And there's a resistance I have to that. Like, I have done one. I did Terry O'Reilly by Skype,
Fantastic.
Which was a successful conversation, but partly because he's used to it. You know, he's done many, many interviews. He's used to the whole idea of radio. I mean, it's his thing. Mm-hmm. But I'm resistant to it because we don't have what you and I are having right now, which is an authentic dialogue that I have to appreciate your humanity across the table, and the dignity of both of us is coming to play in this conversation. And I'm not going to say the things that, I guess, not that I do this, but if I were the kind of person to go onto Twitter and call people names, I wouldn't do that in here. Maybe some people can, but it is far less likely and much more difficult to do so, which then engenders us with a more productive conversation. And it also allows us to dig in. I mean, I find the internet, social media, extremely addictive, right? And the fact of putting my phone away for an hour is very powerful and an important pause. It's kind of a theme of this show, really, where people really appreciate taking the time out from the daily grind and having a pause to think about these things, and to think about it in depth, but having another person to bounce off of it and also to challenge the ideas. And I wonder, in a world in which people don't get the same dopamine fix that they get off of their phone in a meeting with 10 other people who are droning on about whatever. You know, we've all been to committee meetings. I just wonder, to what extent would social media or just technology interfere?
Yeah.
But it can also amplify, and I know that that's true too.
Yeah. You mean it can amplify existing prejudices?
It can, yes, but I think it can also amplify the power of a group of people.
Yes.
Well, what 10 people can achieve with a cell phone is far greater than what 10 people can achieve with a pitchfork, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not a Luddite, and I think there is amazing benefits of technology, and in particular, the way in which police forces in the States have been held to account by citizens holding up a cell phone is quite remarkable. Yeah. And has brought to the world news and ideas that they may not have known. Also, you know, one of the great things about the internet is it's not constrained by space. So the rise of long-form journalism by major media outlets is a great point in favor of the internet. And, you know, I'd be remiss to say that this kind of thing, where it's an hour-long conversation that's done, I presume, relatively cheaply, wouldn't be possible as well without the technology. So it does have its place, but I think that when we're talking about problem solving and deliberating over collective problems, there's no better substitute than sitting in a room.
Yeah. And that's the power of electing people and sending them to a city to sit in rooms and talk about things.
Yeah.
There still is a power to that, I think. And when I spent time in Ottawa, that was apparent to me many times, just having people, whether they were elected officials or they were bureaucrats or political appointees or whatever, sitting in a room hashing things out. You know, you can't help but be creative when you're a human being in a room with other human beings.
Right. And the power of talk is pretty impressive. it's pretty impressive because there are nuances and subtleties that conversation gives that you don't have over the internet.
Jonathan, I've got 10 things I want to run by you. So this is like the lightning round, really. Uh-oh. So just get a quick response to each of these words. Not sometimes they're not so quick, but the goal is to be brief. Brevity is a gift, as they say. So the first one is democracy. Go.
Under threat and fragile, must be nourished.
Yeah.
Is that too much?
No, it's actually no. But I have a question as a follow-up to that, because I often put democracy as a word in these top 10 lists or whatever, and I often get the response, needs to be protected, under threat, needs to be defended. And I guess for someone who studies this stuff, how do we defend it?
Right. That's great. And I think the first thing is to recognize that it is fragile and it is new. We've all lived under democracy in this country, if you were born here, and to not take it for granted. And how do we nurture it is by becoming engaged, by not only voting, but recognizing that we all have a place to play in the collective conversation and taking every opportunity to do so.
Yeah, and I think the talk we've had about citizen assemblies would be along that line. I think that's one way to engage, even if it's informal and there's no power that this assembly has. Having a group of people discussing this stuff can lead to interesting.
Yeah, we call it the democratic dividend because, in these spaces and places, citizens leave having a much better awareness of the complexity of politics. And they have a much more appreciation of the challenging role that politicians play. I actually think that politicians are generally well-meaning and well-intentioned, hard-working individuals. And I think what changes them is the partisan nature of their business.
Absolutely. And I think you said hard-working, and that is so key. I mean, these people put in so many hours and so many days, and then they're criticized for going on vacation for like a Sunday, because they have to, because it's a highly competitive business. And you don't want to get, unless, of course, you're in just a safe riding, which are becoming, I think, rarer. I don't know. Or not just safe between parties, but safe within the party. You might have someone challenge you and take your seat from you. It's possible.
Sure. Ask Ralph Goodale.
Right, yeah. Who, has been in politics since the 70s and lost a seat in Regina, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. The next one is populism.
Wow. Well, populism, I think, is the idea that people feel threatened by the other. And what that symbolizes to me is this growing rift between average people and elite. And I mean elite in perhaps a different way than people might hear. I mean economic elite. We haven't really talked about economics here, but the growing rift between the very wealthy and the rest of us may be one reason for populism, and maybe one reason for the growth of populism, that people see themselves being short-shrifted by the country and the economic values of the country. Just ask, the unemployed worker in Pennsylvania, or ask the unemployed oil person in Alberta. And I think the idea of populism is not so much about us and them, but about the traditional way they've thought about politics in the world changing.
Well, in a way, populism is sort of the froth on the surface of a much deeper trend of economic inequality.
Absolutely.
Which not only has been increasing since, say, the 1970s, but increasing at an increasing rate, at an accelerating rate. And it's impossible to see a point at which, if it continues accelerating and increasing the way that it is, there's a breaking point to that. It can't go on forever. We will become an absurd society if it does. And so, therefore, populism, in a way, is a reaction to this, which has to be appreciated as such. Yeah.
Exactly. Populism is an effect of a larger phenomenon.
Right.
I agree completely.
Yeah. Okay, the next one is, now this isn't the party, this is just the small L, liberal.
So when you say small L liberal, you mean the values of being a tolerant, multicultural, diverse.
We could say the North American version of liberal as opposed to the classic British word liberal. Because of the recent election, probably be smart to do that. But yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Canadians rightly are praised for being tolerant and diverse and respecting individual views, but also being supportive of individuals who need assistance. And to be liberal is to focus on the individual and to focus on recognizing diversity, and also to believe that one is in charge of their own destiny. So it is both an amalgam of small government, which is a traditional liberal virtue, but also in this country's context, the idea that the state should play a role for those people who are worse off.
Yeah. Conservative, small c, conservative.
Well, I mean, small c conservatives believe that it's really important to preserve what has done best for society, and the unfortunate thing about the way that word is used in the modern sense is that people confuse it for its modern use, which is actually a radical force. So when we talk about conservatism in the States, we're talking about using judges that are not elected but are picked because of, or actually in some states they are elected, for partisan purposes, and using that to thwart the democratic will of people. Mm-hmm. So conservative is a nasty word in some sense, because it is now come to mean those forces which are used to accelerate change quickly, which is the exact opposite.
Yeah, it's interesting because the classic definition of conservative, even if we go back to Edmund Burke and talking about, let's just everyone calm down. Things are going to change, but we don't have to change them overnight. Yeah. We can be incremental about this. We can watch things happen. We don't have to have a revolution and kill each other. We can slowly reform.
It's a belief in an organic society.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a wonderful concept that seems very Canadian to me.
Absolutely.
But it's been co-opted by a completely different force, as you say.
Yeah.
And a conservative, I think, would be in favor of environmental protection by virtue of that word.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good point, that a conservative might be a stronger environmentalist than otherwise, and a conservative would actually rein in corporate profits in order to preserve the collective good.
Yeah. I mean, that's been traditionally what conservatives have done.
Exactly.
Which actually brings us to the next point, or the next word, environmentalism.
Yeah, and environmentalism, I think, it will be increasingly the biggest preoccupation of citizens, period. And all of the other issues we deal with are kind of a subset of that in some way. And when you think about the other big issue about the growing wealth between the rich and the poor, or economic inequality generally, that's all a subset of how we think about the world in which we live. And environmentalism, which is to treat the world as if it was an organic, true being that should be nurtured and that we are only one component of, is really important.
Mm-hmm. The next one is Quebec.
Right. Well, it is going to be really interesting to see the role of the Bloc in Canada's Parliament. Now we're the third largest party, as it was before, and what role that has for Quebecers and what role they play. And increasingly, it seems obvious that they will not be a separatist party, but rather a Quebec nationalist party. And the impact of that party on the national landscape will be interesting to see if it fuels Western alienation or seen as an example of how best to accommodate that feeling. Yeah. So will it give rise to a Western separatist party, for example?
This is a side note. What do you think of what people are calling Wexit? Wexit. Western separatism. Do you think this is just a fad? I mean, this has been visited before by Albertans. This is not the first time some Albertans have gotten together to form a separatist movement. But do you think that this is ridiculous, or do you think that this has some steam this time?
Neither. Or maybe both. I think it's a bit ridiculous as a real idea, as a genuine idea. And I think it does have a bit of steam because of the electoral results. It is important, however, because it represents symbolically, and politics is really largely about symbols, I think. It represents symbolically the frustration and lack of accommodation that the West has had, and it encapsulates in a short form that sentiment really well. So I think it's going to be an important touchstone for the Trudeau Liberals over the next few years.
The next word is Trudeau.
Right. Down but not out.
Okay.
I think he will realize, if he hasn't already, that last electoral results were humbling, and he needs to govern accordingly.
His victory speech was very much a victory speech. It wasn't very humble on the night of October 21st.
Yeah, that's right. And, Joe Clark, when he won a minority government in 1979, he said he was going to govern as if he had a majority, and he lost 9 months later. And I think Trudeau would be wise to heed that and pay attention to the role that the opposition plays. But I think there's still lots of steam left in the Trudeau brand. And I think what he'll have to do is thread this very fine needle to accommodate both the party, his party on the left, but also the NDP, but also middle-class Canadians and Albertans who have different sorts of views, perhaps.
Just that word brand that you just used, I find interesting, because that's very much what he has created and what he is, what he offers, what he wins on is the Trudeau brand. And I just wonder, I mean, that's part of the criticism of him too, is that the whole Andrew Scheer, he's a fraud and a phony. Right. He's nothing more than a brand, nothing more than an image. Is this idea of his brand sustainable if he is nothing more than that?
Yeah, well, maybe this is a topic for another conversation, because the influence of branding on political parties and on politicians is huge. And all parties are susceptible to that. Where a brand is most successful is if you don't recognize that they are being branded.
Right.
So the fact that we are talking about the Trudeau brand is really just evidence that it's not a successful branding exercise.
Interesting.
But I think branding has a sort of a bad word. I mean, in some ways, it's just another shorthand cue for the voter to think about this constellation of issues. And when you think about Justin Trudeau in 2015, he was the guy to do politics differently, right?
Sure.
And that was his brand. So I think that's fine. And I think that he was brought quickly back down to earth, and we'll see how that affects his brand. Yeah,
I'm interested to get your perspective on this, because you've done a lot of work on political advertising. That's been one of your meat and potatoes as a political scientist. And just as an anecdote, back when I was on that election campaign in 2015, the Liberal Party gave out a template for lawn signs across the country. This is how you're going to print them. And they all said Team Trudeau, right? That was the brand of the Liberal Party in 2015. It still was in 2019. We decided we couldn't have that on our lawn signs. We needed to not use his name as much as possible in Calgary in 2015. And we won. It was Kent Harris' campaign.
Right.
And we changed it to Real Change, which was the motto of the campaign. We got in big trouble from the party, but it was too late. We'd printed our signs. We knew that was going to happen. We shot first, asked questions later, because we knew that the Central Party in Ottawa wouldn't understand. They knew that they would feel like they were stabbed in the back, or that we're not into Trudeau, or whatever it was. But we knew we had to make those decisions in order to win. And that kind of fracturing of the brand at the time, I thought, made for a stronger national party, where you have people willing and able to make decisions at a local level, and willing and able to be your own person at a local level. But this goes back to the conversation about party discipline earlier, where we live in a country where you have to toe the party line. And I just wonder, is there room in this country for a party to be a bit more decentralized? Would that make for success, or is that just a recipe for disaster?
Well, you're going to have to talk to my Ph.D. student, Jacob Robbins-Cantor, because he's doing a dissertation on this exact subject about the diversity of local campaigns and portraying themselves. And, there's a number of reasons, one of which is obviously electoral success, but two of which, and I'm sure this was the case in Calgary, is to appeal to local interest, that the brand wouldn't resonate there as much as another message would. But also, when you think about the idea of a brand, like a commercial brand, you think of one consistent idea. And political parties are both a national brand, but they also have franchises. And you want to make sure that those franchises have some opportunity to be different while at the same time maintaining the consistent brand.
Yeah, and that's the trick, right? Because the sign was still red, and real change was still the motto. But you're totally right, and that because we are complex voters too. We don't just vote on one thing. There are a multitude of factors. Okay, the next one is social media.
Social media. Well, it is become increasingly, I think, a place where independent tribes battle it out with one another without regard for having a meaningful conversation. I think that social media has an opportunity to really engage people, but unfortunately in a tribalistic society where people are interested in reinforcing their existing opinions and not listening to new ideas, it just reinforces prejudice. So I think it's, on balance, not a force for the good. And I think among young people, I think it's really bad.
Yeah.
I think it misinforms them. I think it is a cause of depression. I think it's a reason why they don't seek out real life engagements with friends and young people. And I see this on campus at Queen's University all the time.
I also think that there's a problem here that it is so engineered, right? Like this ecosystem in which we live online is highly engineered by Facebook, by Twitter, by whomever.
Yes.
When we talk about the internet, it's something different.
Yes.
We're talking about this open, where you said earlier that there's unlimited space to share ideas and to have conversations, to do long-form journalism. But social media is kind of crunching that in to an engineered system where it's just trying to keep me on the site as long as possible to see as much information and advertising as possible. And that's for me, that's both the addiction, but also the problem, the thing that could be unsustainable and could lead us to really disastrous outcomes.
Absolutely. I mean, it was Marshall McLuhan who said the medium is the message. And what he meant by that is that the content of a message is completely derived from how it is said. So YouTube is a particular medium that demands certain kinds of messaging. It demands you to be visual and powerful and evocative. And that language of the visual is taken over from the language of the spoken word, like this is, or the language of the written word. And increasingly social media, especially Instagram, is becoming about a battle of images rather than ideas.
Well, and what's interesting is if you turn your phone on to black and white mode, it has been shown to be less addictive. The colors are part of why you enjoy it. I mean, there's other things too. It's the speed at which things go across the screen. It's the diversity of content as you scroll down. But the colors themselves and the brightness and vividness of the colors are hugely important on keeping you on that screen.
Right.
A lot of game designers know this when they're designing a video game, whether it's for a laptop or a console or a phone. They know that keeping you engaged has a lot to do with the color palette. And that's partly why Candy Crush, which is a very colorful game, does better than, I don't know, like Dungeons and Dragons or something, right?
Right.
Anyways, second to last one. It's a word that is used a lot and thrown around a lot, especially on the right. And it's hard to understand what it means. It's globalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, globalism is also this word that means a lot and doesn't mean anything. And, when you think about how we exist in our society, globalism is it. We are engaged with the world through our ideas, through our products, through information. But it is unfortunately being co-opted as something negative. And I think the distortion of the English language by politicians for partisan ends is really tragic because we fail to understand what these words really mean.
Last one, privacy.
Well, that's a big one to end on because you talked about the engineered ecosystem of our world through Facebook and Twitter and Privacy, of course, is a huge concern. And we are increasingly giving up our privacy online for having this minor hit or this addiction fulfilled. And in the long run, that might be a problem.
Yeah, and what's tricky is that the paradigm is shifting, or maybe already has shifted, that not only are we doing this, but we're okay with it.
Yeah.
I brought up this example before, but the Edward Snowden thing, when that came out, was a big deal.
Yeah.
And everyone thought this is a sea change.
That's right.
This is, wow, now we know what government has been doing. Well, it's going to stop. Well, I think it was only a couple of weeks that people went, okay.
I'm okay with that.
And now it's a joke. Now we know the government is spying on your phone. Whether or not it's happening, we just all assume that it is happening.
Yeah,
and that's
and the fact that we're willing to give it up so quickly is
right.
the real problem. You're right. And it's hard to, I notice this when I talk in my university classes. The students just accept it as a matter of course. And that's unfortunate. I don't know what can be done about that.
Jonathan, this has been a really fascinating conversation.
It's fun talking, Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for the conversation.
To learn more about Jonathan Rose, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me by email or on social media. Let me know what you think of this show and give me your suggestions for future episodes, whether it's a subject to be discussed or a guest to discuss it with. Your quote of the week is from Marshall McLuhan, who was mentioned by Jonathan earlier. He says that a point of view can be a dangerous luxury when substituted for insight and understanding. Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for this wonderful music, and special thanks for this episode to Jonathan Rose and the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University for giving us the space in which to record. Next week, we're talking with Daryl Cloran, Artistic Director of the Citadel Theatre in Edmonton, Alberta. I'll see you then.